Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I'm sure all of you, if not most of you, are aware of what happened in New Zealand just this morning, UK time. For those who are not, just a very brief summary. Two mosques were targeted in New Zealand by white terrorists who had a focus on killing Muslims, and they have killed or injured at least 49, including children. And I think obviously all of us are really shocked and really appalled, and some of us, at least in the West, are living in some degree of fear because there's been a number of incidents now, especially in the West, not just in the West, but especially in the West, where mosques have been targeted by white terrorists or quote unquote extremists, if you want to use that term. And it's getting to a point now where any mosque in the West can be targeted by these individuals. And I think there has to be a real sort of try to really for us to move forward from here and not simply react in fear. There has to be a sort of cognition and understanding of what is going on, and from that try to have a real sort of understanding of how we need to move forward in a proactive way that's good for us and ultimately good for the world. And the first thing that needs to be understood is the motivation of these people. Now, this wasn't a wild, random attack. They had a manifesto. Their objective was to create an atmosphere of fear and to incite violence against Muslims. That is clear. And they also, in that manifesto, referenced things like, Muslim migrants invading Europe, the Bosnian genocide, of how relevant that is, and even referenced the Ottomans. And they even referenced more contemporary events like the Rochdale or the attack on Finsbury Park or Andros Breivik. Now, what does this all show you? First of all, is that this is a part of a global trend of Islamophobia that's being driven by a global Islamophobic narrative, and so many times. And the second thing as well, which is equally important, is that despite the way in which the media tries to whitewash these incidents as some kind of nutcase, a mad person who's doing mad things, it's clear that this was meticulously planned. It was planned to send a message, and it was done in such a sophisticated way that we can never dismiss an attack like this as irrational. Now, this was done with rational minds, okay? And it's totally rational in that context and totally logical where this is coming from. And that is coming from a narrative, whether it emboldens already sort of like neo-Nazi or white supremacist tendencies, or whether it tries to essentially make sense to a vulnerable white person, whatever that is, that narrative is stringing a logic and a rationale that basically says that the presence of Muslims, just your sheer presence in a country, in a town or city, your presence as a people who believe in Islam is an inherent threat, and therefore you must be one contained and dealt with, two civilized, and if need be, killed, killed in mass numbers for you to be under control. Okay, that's what that narrative is saying to people. So, and this is the thing, is that whilst and the reason why I'm focusing on narrative right now is because everybody needs to get that these incidents are being driven by narrative. Narrative drives action, and narratives of hate drive actions of hate like this. And we have to, as people, not just like in the UK, in the West, but globally, understand that this increase of attacks on Muslims, whether it's in the West or in India, or whether it's by regimes that buy into the whole sort of anti-Islam narrative, like Saudi and Emirates and so on. All of this is being the driving of hate crimes and the driving of these shootings and even the legislation of all of this is being driven by that single narrative that you Muslims are a problem. Okay, so that's the first thing that we need to acknowledge, and by acknowledging that, we have to understand that this nightmare will not end unless we mobilize, organize, and effectively tackle this problem on a narrative basis. We cannot just simply try to protect ourselves, ask for help from the state, for police or whatever else, and try to essentially say stop the hate. No, there needs to be a narrative, essentially counter propaganda to try and essentially dispel all the myths that are being essentially propagated and believed by the wider population. So that's the key thing, and I'm stressing on this because yes, okay, there has been a wider understanding of how narrative drives society. There has been a wider understanding of essentially why these how like from people and from organizations, there's been a wide understanding from them to understand essentially how narrative drives action, but not all of us are getting it, and all of us need to get it, because if we don't get why this is happening and what is it that we need to do, then you're not able to support the right organizations that are leading on that way, and they're not able to essentially defend you effectively as they can do if they had your support. So that's one thing, is that understanding that, I've said it many times now, understanding narrative and its role in that. But we have to also understand that it's not just the Islamophobia industry that's driving this now. It's not just elements that are really fringe, really sort of extreme, and essentially just trying to essentially push a narrative on social media. Mainstream politicians that are at this is too. So, a few tweets on social media explicitly exposed like how New Zealand's politicians, yes, they condemned this attack, of course they would, but they were complicit in passing laws that would essentially normalize white supremacy by eroding multiculturalism. Okay, even like today, you've had a an Australian senator saying today that the reason why the terror attack happened is simply because of the increase in Muslim presence. There you go. That's what I'm saying. Like he's using this, an attack on Muslims, to essentially normalize the narrative that the reason why this is happening is not because of those white terrorists. No, they're also somehow the victim here. It's because Muslims are present here and they are unwanted. That's the core reason. And therefore, if that's the core reason, then essentially deportations, more attacks, and so on are legitimized. Okay, so they're using this as essentially means to further their own narrative, even though bizarrely it doesn't fit, but it'll fit for a lot of people who already believe in that narrative. Okay, but also like more focused on the UK, like Theresa May. Obviously, when she condemns this attack, she is essentially going to do so sometime, either publicly on Parliament, but you have to remember, she is the one that has pioneered Prevent, Schedule 7, lots of different other laws, including the Snooper Charters, which has institutionalized not just authoritarianism, but also Islamophobia. Okay, and so like we need to essentially call that out as well. We can't just simply be like, all right, fine, you condemned the attack, a pat on the back for you, well done. There needs to be a call for you, for the Prime Minister and generally all politicians to recall Prevent, to recall all those laws that are focused on stigmatizing, demonizing, and persecuting Muslims. So like that needs to happen as well. We can't just simply react to this with just like, yes, okay, we need to make dua, we need to essentially have all those things that makes us strong as Muslims, but we also have to say, look, you may as politicians, you will obviously have to condemn, but we want to see action. We want to acknowledge the fact that it's your laws that are normalizing people to hate us, and you have to do away with all of that if you really mean what you say. Okay, and so we should be calling for the scrapping of prevent, for the scrapping of Schedule 7. We should be calling for those laws to essentially be swept away, in order for us to essentially make sure that the institutionally, and through policy, that we are not being demonized as well. Okay, and that also, it means that any bodies that any Muslim bodies, any Muslim masjids, or organizations that are complicit to this, especially prevent any mosques that are involved in dealing with and cooperating with policies and laws that or essentially programs or directives that are geared towards demonizing the Muslim community. They need to be held to account, and they need to basically be said to them by their own congregations that no, you cannot allow the house of Allah, where we pray and we essentially assert our right to pray to our Creator, to allow our committee or the leaders of that masjid to support a program that is essentially encouraging and normalizing the eventual attack upon not just the masjids, but also the people that pray in that masjid. It's an oxymoron that a masjid would support such a policy, and yet it's so widespread in the UK. Okay, and that's one thing that needs to be done. But also more generally is that, look, how many times do we have to see a mosque be attacked for us, for the mosque leaders to even think about preparation, or like processes, or like, crisis management? What is it that are you going to do as a mosque to make sure that if some white terrorist comes down and thinks about trying to attack the congregation, what is it that you have in place? Are you investing into the right relationship so that there's a quick response, and there's priority by, say, the police or the council or whatever else? What is being done? Or even like when it comes to, like, getting solicitors or campaigners to educate their congregation in regards to Schedule 7. Yeah? So there's lots that's being done that isn't being done. And all we're doing, just reacting in terms of emotion. We go on a demonstration or a vigil, but there's no strategic, or even tactical sort of like ideas that are being implemented that will put us in a better position that we were before. Okay, so yes, there's narrative, but what is it that practically you as an individual, and if not as an organization or lobbying of an organization, that are you going to essentially push for to make sure that you and your people are safer than tomorrow than you were yesterday? Okay, so there's that. Also, like, we have to, and this is more broadly as well, just to sort of tie this up, is that at the same time, yes, we can essentially call for these domestic laws to be recalled. But, like, I saw a tweet this morning by Imran Khan. This is something we've always said generally as an organization, but like like it was really nice to see a leader of a Muslim country say this. And it's not just the Islamophobic industry that has been normalizing this, nor has it been Islamophobic politicians. It's been the war on terror. It's been Western foreign policy, essentially. And there needs to be also an offensive, a narrative offensive, on the basis in which the war on terror and the subsequent sort of securitization and the foreign policy of these countries need to essentially tackled. So because essentially since 9/11, from the very beginning, as soon as that happened, Islamophobic narratives were being leveraged and essentially normalized by the war on terror in itself. Yeah, and there has to be a clear link of understanding for Muslims and non-Muslims that if it wasn't for the war on terror, there would be no need for an agenda to demonize Muslims. That should be clear. The foreign policy interests or geopolitical interests of the West is always followed by a period of demonization in those Western countries. So, like, really, what comes down to, and this is the last point, is that overall, we cannot have just simply an emotional reaction. There has to be a demand for equality in our own countries in the West, and also for freedom abroad, because we are in our existence as Muslims in the West is inextricably linked to the existence of Muslims abroad. Yeah, and this world is a small world now. There is no difference between the Muslim in this narrative. There is no difference between the Muslim that is being bombed in Yemen or in Syria or wherever else in Palestine, and you as a Muslim in this country, in the UK, in New Zealand or Australia. You're all tarred with the same brush, and so there has to be a form of unity, at least on narrative. Yeah, that there has to be a demand for equality and freedom, rather than just be like we are not bad people, or like please don't hurt us. That just seems to be the reaction of Muslims nowadays, and we have to be much more empowering, much more forward thinking, and much more firm and confident in our demand, essentially to make sure that especially our youth know how to react and know how to press forward to ensure that they and their children are living in a better tomorrow. So please let me know what you think. Do come back at me if there's things that you don't agree with. And essentially, we need to make sure that as Muslims, we are much more stronger politically. What is being said, and what is being done, and that's when we can really take steps strategically to move forward. Jazakallah khair for listening to me. Assalamu alaikum.